Hey guys, what's happening? Roosh here, and today what we're going to talk about are cell types. And there's actually two cell types that we're going to talk about. The first one is called a prokaryote, and the second one is called a eukaryote. This third one over here off to the right, that's actually not a cell type, that's actually a virus. And viruses aren't considered living things, and we'll talk more about those in just a moment. Well, let's go over the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes. So if you take a look at these two pictures, to the left we have the prokaryote, and to the right we have our eukaryote. And if I were to ask you which one looks more complex, which one looks like it has more stuff going on inside of it, it would be the eukaryote. Okay, so eukaryotes are far more complex than a prokaryote. Let's go over what prokaryotes are. First, I use the little mnemonic that pro rhymes with no. So prokaryotes have no membrane-bound organelles. Essentially, if you were to look inside, they don't have these fancy organelles that the eukaryotes do. Okay, and we'll go over what these structures are in the eukaryotes. So all these fancy structures that eukaryotes have, prokaryotes do not. They have no nucleus. So if you look at this prokaryote, you'll see it looks like this strand right here. These strands is actually its DNA. Now its DNA is just free floating inside of itself, whereas if we look at a eukaryote, if we look over here to the right, the eukaryote has its DNA stored inside of a nucleus. Okay, so all this has the DNA. The prokaryote only has simple organelles, so things like ribosomes, and not much else, cytoplasm and a membrane. Again, the DNA is not located in a nucleus. In an example of a prokaryote, I want you to think single-celled organisms such as bacteria. Okay. Now, when we take a look at eukaryotes, eu rhymes with do. So eukaryotes do have membrane-bound organelles. And again, next week we're going to go over what exactly these organelles are. Eukaryotes do have a nucleus, and that's where the DNA is found. They do have complex organelles, okay, which are the membrane-bound organelles. And they're mostly multicellular. There are a few single-celled eukaryotes, but mostly I want you to think of multi-celled organisms, such as plants and animals. Okay, so you and I, all of our cells, our skin cells, our kidney cells, liver cells, brain cells, all of those are eukaryotic cells. Okay, even in plants, because plants have these complex structures. Okay, and plants have a nucleus to store their DNA, and we'll talk more about that next week. But now let's go into that third category that I mentioned, viruses, and why don't viruses fall under a cell type? So first, viruses, they're not a cell. They do contain DNA or RNA. Now, if I were to look at this image of a virus, if I were to look at this top portion, I would see these coils. And these coils, those strands, that is their DNA or RNA. Now, what's surrounding that actually is not a cell membrane. It is actually just a protein coat. Okay, so they don't have a cell membrane like the other cell types do. We'll talk more about that next week. Basically, all a virus is a protein coat with DNA or RNA inside of it. Now, why aren't they considered living things? Well, in order for a virus to replicate, in order for a virus to make more copies of itself, it has to infect a host. Okay, so viruses can't reproduce on their own. They have to infect something. If I go back to the prokaryote and the eukaryote, each of these cell types, they have machinery inside of them. Okay, these little ribosomes. And over here in the eukaryote, they have little machines inside of them that help replicate and help cell division. Okay, a virus cannot do that on its own. So how does a virus replicate? How does a virus make more of itself? The first thing it has to do is it has to infect a host. So this would be a virus infecting a bacterial cell. Okay. What's going to happen is that virus is going to shoot its DNA or RNA into the prokaryote or into the cell. Once it shoots its DNA into the cell, then it's going to use the machinery of that cell to make more copies of itself. And after there's so many copies, after there's, it's made several copies of itself inside of that prokaryotic cell, those viruses actually break out, destroy that cell, and then each one will go and infect a new cell. Okay, so quick recap. Two cell types that we talked about. We have a prokaryote and we have a eukaryote. The pro rhymes with no. Pro rhymes with no. And they have no membrane-bound organelles, and they have no nucleus. They're very, very simple. I want you guys to remember that. Prokaryotes are very simple. Okay, and I want you to think bacteria, single-celled organisms. Now, when we look at a eukaryote, eu rhymes with do, and they do have membrane-bound organelles. Those are these structures again, okay, these very complex structures. They do have a nucleus to store their DNA, and they're mostly multicellular, so think plants and animals, okay? Those are all eukaryotic cells. Next, we talked about viruses, which are not a cell. They have either DNA or RNA inside of a protein coat. Viruses cannot replicate on their own. They have to infect a host. Once they infect the host, they use the machinery, the organelles inside of that host, and make more copies of itself until finally they break out and infect more cells. Okay, so that was cell types and viruses, and I hope that was helpful.